These are not gods, and they are not angels. They are rulers without faces, parasites without mercy. They move unseen, shaping the laws of the world, tightening the cage around every soul born into flesh. They whisper doubts into the mind, hunger for fear, and delight in forgetfulness. To the Gnostics, they were the wardens of existence itself. They call them the Archons, and they're still here. If you too are parasites without mercy, check out Pantheon Apparel, our clothing brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. The demiurge built the cage, shaping matter into a flawless system, but blind to the true source. He believed himself a god, but his power was incomplete. To maintain his rule, he created enforcers, rulers who would guard the heavens and bind humanity in ignorance. If you want to know more about the demiurge himself, I've covered him in another video. This story belongs to his wardens. They are called Archons, and the name alone tells you everything. It comes from the Greek archon, ruler, authority, governor. But they don't rule through worship, nor do they need temples or prayers. The Archons rule through law, structure and control. And they do it so silently, most of us never even realize we're being ruled. In Gnostic cosmology, the Archons were jailers. They were born from error, the fallout of a mistake that should never have happened. They serve the demiurge, yes, but they are not his angels. They are his bureaucracy, his enforcers, his personal machine, operating with instinct, blind to truth, hostile for freedom, obsessed with order. The ancient texts found at the Nag Hammadi describe him in terrifying detail. Their leader, Yaldabaoth, another name for the demiurge, bears the face of a lion and the body of a serpent, a form that combines predatory power with cold, reptilian instinct. His Archons follow suit. Not beautiful, not divine, but monstrous. A donkey-headed judge, a seven-headed serpent, a baboon with a crown. These are the masks of imitation, snippets of creation worn by those who cannot truly create. They are distortions, copies, reflections without source. And yet, they govern the very structure of reality. The Archons control matter, time, sensation, instinct. They impose the laws of cause and effect, of motion and decay. They assign and they define. They build the systems that trap the soul in distraction, desire and delusion. Where the demiurge forged the prison, the Archons maintain it, and they are meticulous. To the Gnostics, evil was not wild or chaotic. Evil was regulated, layered, enforced. That is the horror of the Archons. Not that they're monsters, but that they're administrators. That your pain, your fear, your confusion might not be accidents of the world, but deliberate features of the system. The Archons don't need you to believe in them. They only need you to obey without knowing why. To understand the Archons, you have to understand their domain. Reality was not seen as open or free. It was structured, layer upon layer, with the physical world at the bottom and the realm of the spirit sealed far above. The soul in its purest form did not belong here. It had fallen, and rising back to the source wasn't a matter of belief or repentance. It was a battle through bureaucracy. The entire cosmos was imagined as a kind of spiritual fortress. A material world was the lowest floor, the furthest from the source. Above it were 7 layers of heaven, each one ruled by a powerful Archon. These 7 rulers were directly linked to the 7 known planets of the ancient world: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each planet was believed to govern one layer of reality, and each one served as a checkpoint, a closed gate the soul had to pass through after death. This ascent was a journey of the soul, mapped out step by step. When a person died, their soul began to rise, but at each planetary sphere it was confronted by a gatekeeper, an Archon, who would test it with interrogation. The Archons questioned the soul, demanded it identify itself, its origin, its knowledge, and its right to proceed. If the soul didn't answer correctly, it had forgotten who it was or where it came from. It would be turned away and cast down into the world of matter, reincarnated, bound again to flesh. But there were ways to resist. In some Gnostic schools, initiates were taught secret knowledge to prepare for death, names of the Archons, passwords, codes, phrases of power. Some texts describe this as spiritual smuggling, slipping past the rulers with forbidden truths. In the first Apocalypse of James, for example, the soul is armed with instructions on what to say when confronted at each gate, survival strategies for escaping the system. Because the Archons weren't punishing the wicked, they weren't offering salvation, they were maintaining order, they were keeping the structure sealed. And in this structure, ignorance was the mechanism. The Archons didn't torment souls for pleasure, they filtered them like administrators working a file system, sorting, resetting, recycling. Souls who failed to remember were sent back, souls who knew too much were challenged harder. Escape was rare, most never made it past the first gate. This wasn't hell, it was worse. It was a system. The sky has always been read as a message. For thousands of years, humanity has looked upwards for signs, fate in the stars, gods in the planets, omens in their motion. But in Gnostic thought, that sky was a message from within the prison, and the planets were not guides, they were locks. Saturn stood at the highest gate, the outermost ring of the prison. He ruled limitation, time, death, decay. Cold, slow, and relentless, Saturn was the final enforcer, the last lock between the soul and the divine realm. His weapon was inevitability. Everything that begins must end, and he made sure of it. His influence on the soul was despair, the sense that no matter what you do, nothing will change. Jupiter, beneath Saturn, ruled over authority, law, and hierarchy. On the surface, he offered justice, but through the archonic lens, his justice was control. A system that rewards obedience, punishes deviation, and keeps souls bound to structure. His influence was the illusion of order, the belief that the system is good because it is well maintained. Mars governed conflict, aggression, blood, and fear. He bound the soul through violence, both external and internal. He inflamed anger, invited war, pushed humans to destroy each other and themselves. Mars didn't just feed off war, he made sure it never ended. The sun should have been a symbol of illumination, but the Archon assigned to it used light to blind. He was the light of distraction, ego, ambition, performance, the belief that power, recognition, or success were the highest truths. The soul caught here didn't feel imprisoned, it felt admired. That was the trap. Venus ruled over pleasure, desire, and seduction. Her domain was beauty twisted into attachment. Through her, the soul was bound by longing, physical, emotional, even spiritual. Love itself, weaponized. A craving that could never be fulfilled. Mercury, the messenger, governed communication, knowledge, thought, but not truth. His trap was misdirection, endless words with no wisdom, endless thoughts with no clarity. He clouded the mind with complexity, contradiction, and noise. The soul that stalled here did not suffer from ignorance, but from confusion. And finally, the moon, the closest gate to the world of flesh. She ruled over illusion, instinct, the subconscious. Her power was rhythm, the cycle of sleep and waking, birth and death, forgetfulness and return. She governed the veil between spirit and body, and her influence kept the soul anchored in repetition. The moon was the beginning of the descent, and for many souls, the place they returned to, again and again and again. These seven ruled the heavens and conditions of existence. They weren't external threats, however, they were internalized, mirrored in human behavior, culture, emotion. Each one locked the soul in a different way, and each one had to be passed to escape the system. And so the horror deepens. The planets we once saw as divine, as noble lights, were in fact barriers. The heavens were not a map, they were a security system, and the Archons were not beings of honour, they were locks on the cage. Not all chains are visible, and not all Archons rule from above. The soul may be trapped by planetary spheres, but the deeper prison is built within. The Archons don't simply govern the structure of the cosmos, they replace it inside the human psyche. Each one becomes a force within the mind, a fracture in perception, a hint in the dark corners of thought. They live through us. Fear, desire, shame, pride, these are signatures, symptoms of archonic influence. When a person is consumed by rage, the Archon of Mars is active. When they crave validation, it is the sun speaking. When they are paralyzed by self-doubt or nihilism, Saturn has already done his work. And this is how the prison sustains itself, because the soul no longer needs to be bound from the inside, it polices itself. It adopts the values of the system. It chases success. It fears death. It obeys laws it never agreed to, worships gods it never chose, and calls this freedom. The greatest danger was not in sin, but in forgetfulness. A soul that sins still acts. A soul that forgets simply obeys. It moves through life half awake, mistaking programming for purpose. And this is where the Archons thrive, in habit, in repetition, in unconscious thought. They don't manifest as monsters. They speak in your own voice. They hide behind your reflection. They are the internal critics, the irrational fears, the compulsions you can't explain. They are every moment you feel broken, but don't know why. The ancient Gnostic teachers understood this long before the language of psychology existed. They described the Archons of rulers of fate as psychological parasites, forces that embed themselves in the mind and feed on confusion. And the more entangled they become, the more distant the soul grows from its source. It is programming rather than possession. To break free, the soul must begin to observe, to remember, to separate its thoughts from the ones implanted, to question what it's been told is normal. Until that happens, the Archons remain in control. They don't need to be outside the mind. They've already moved in. If the Archons rule through ignorance, then their only true enemy is knowledge. Gnosis. Gnosis isn't information, nor dogma, ritual, or theology. It can't be memorized or recited. It is remembrance, sudden, irreversible, and internal. A crack in the illusion so complete that the world never looks the same again. To the Gnostics, the soul was not fallen by choice. It was trapped, cast into matter, sealed in flesh, blinded. But within it, buried beneath emotion, instinct, and fear, a spark remained, a fragment of the divine. Gnosis was the moment that spark caught fire, the moment the soul recognized that it did not belong in the world it served. And that recognition was dangerous, because Gnosis is rebellion, one that tears through the architecture of the Archons without warning. A soul that remembers cannot be manipulated. It stops obeying, it stops fearing, and stops playing by the rules. This is where the figure of Christ appears as a disruptor. In Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas, Jesus calls for awareness rather than worship. He speaks in riddles to bypass the Archons, to plant knowledge in those ready to receive it. In these texts, Judas, rather than a traitor, is one who sets Jesus free. The crucifixion is a jailbreak, a final rejection of the system. Gnosis is the key, but it's not safe. It isolates, it cuts, it forces the soul to confront the possibility that everything it called good was part of the trap, that even its deepest desires were programmed responses. It destroys comfort, but it reveals truth. You were never meant to belong here. The Archons can't touch Gnosis. They can block memory, manipulate thought, stir emotion, but they cannot erase direct knowing. Once gnosis arrives, it cannot be undone. The moment you remember, truly remember, they lose their grip. But gnosis can't be forced. There's no 10-step guide for dummies, no ritual that guarantees revelation. It doesn't arrive through belief, or study, or obedience. It arrives when everything false collapses, when the soul refuses to obey, when the illusion fractures beyond repair. And yet it can be prepared for. A mind that questions, a heart that stops chasing comfort, a soul that remembers. These are cracks in the system. The Archons feed on distraction, confusion, obedience, and the more you resist, the more unstable their hold becomes. This isn't a path, it's a confrontation, and most people aren't ready for it. We thought we were in control, but followed rules we never agreed to, fought wars we never started, chased dreams we were told to want. But it was a script, written by things we never saw, things that feed on obedience. They don't need your worship, just your silence, your distraction, your sleep. But if even for a second you remember, the world stops making sense. And that's when it finally starts to make sense.